Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me. Again, Professor Hallett, Professor Ibrahim, I'm very happy to be here with you all. As mentioned before, I'm a third year PhD student at MIT in the program in History, Anthropology, Science, Technology, and Society, or HASS for short, because it is a very long name. My research is about assistive technologies for deaf people in Jordan, which I will not be talking about today. But just a quick plug, this Friday, I am doing a dissertation proposal workshop. So, I'll love, of course, to have any of you there, anyone who's interested in learning more about this. And would love to have your feedback for sure. And I'm also a young NUS fellow with Yale NUS anthropology this year, which is why I'm able to come to this event and really get to know some of you more. I want to clarify that my opening comments today are actually going to be about getting a PhD in the US versus getting a master's in the US or getting a DPhil in the UK. And I mean, part of this is because it's certainly what I know best, but it's also because I think in some ways the PhD is a more momentous decision, right? Getting that compared to some of these other options, right? But I, of course, welcome any questions in the Q&A. Feel free to ask me about any of those things. And hopefully this goes without saying, but this is just my opinion based on my experience applying to graduate school. So, and it should not be taken as gospel truth by any stretch of the imagination. So today my presentation is called, cheekily named, So Why Are You Thinking About Graduate School in Anthropology? Right? And I mean, truly why? I think that's the main question, right? So I think that there is this common misconception, right? That there is this sense in which you get your bachelor's, you get your master's, and then you get your PhD, right? And there's this kind of like natural trajectory where you move along that timeline, right? When I don't think that's really the right way to think about a PhD at all, right? I think that PhD should be thought of as a professional degree, right? It's meant to train you to read, write, do things in a particular way, for a particular field, right? And so in that sense, it should be thought of as more like a law degree, a medical degree, a business degree. And of course, there are some people who choose not to apply to graduate school to go on to further education at all, right? And that's totally fine. I think that, by no means should the PhD be thought of as the natural end to pursuing a college education, right? And there are some people that say things like, oh, the PhD is, it will give you many skills that are applicable to many different areas, which is true, right, to a certain extent. But this makes me think of how a couple of years ago in Singapore, this was when I was in whatever, secondary school, whatever, right? Where people were like, oh, to open an ice cream cafe in Singapore, you need a law degree, right? And it was this kind of joke that was kind of indicative of how, these people went to law school, decided that actually this isn't the field that they want to pursue, and they end up doing other things. And of course, whatever other things they end up doing, the law degree is useful, I'm sure. It helps them in whatever ways, right? But the question is that the best way to get to where you want to go, right? And I think that, the PhD should be thought of in that way as well, right? And so in line with thinking about the PhD as a professional degree, I think that, my strong recommendation, and Jana has already mentioned this, is to work in something else or work in other things before doing a PhD, even if you're very sure, 90% sure that you want to do a PhD, right? And so this happened to me. So, I wanted to do a PhD. I've wanted to do a PhD in anthropology ever since sophomore year, but when I was in my master's program, I was dissuaded from this by my parents and my professors, really in recognition of the fact that, academia is just one path among many, right? There are many different options. And so I ended up moving to Jordan instead. I worked there for 2 years, and I made a lot of connections. I learned the language better, which I think, those are useful skills and useful experiences as anthropologists anyway, right? And those connections, I think, have served me well, right? So I think that the most important question really is, what can a PhD afford you that any other degree cannot, right? And so, I think that there are good answers and not so good answers to these questions, right? So some of these good answers might be like, okay, I have this burning question I really want to answer, and I can only find out through my PhD, right? The second might be something like, intellectual autonomy. And this is something I can attest to. I'm sure Wee Young can, and actually these professors I'm sure can as well, right? So you're being sponsored to really study whatever your heart desires, right? Whatever you find interesting, right? Another question might be, or another response might be, I want to be the best researcher I can. And, the PhD is a training in research, right? And so that is a good reason to go to graduate school, right? Another one might be, I want to teach at a university, right? And so, it's not impossible necessarily to teach at a university without a PhD, but in most cases, it is required, and it is significantly more difficult if you don't have a PhD. Some not as good answers, I think, are things like, it seems like the right thing to do, right? I didn't know what else to do but to go to graduate school, or I did well in school, so I should go to graduate school, right? And this kind of fits in with this like kind of natural trajectory story, right? And here I also want to quickly say that in the last couple of years we've also seen people make comments like doing a PhD is a totally irrational choice, or there's some kind of false consciousness, and I really want to resist these kinds of characterizations as well. Right, I think that as mentioned before, lots of PhDs in the US are fully funded programs that give you a stable source of income and access to health insurance, right? And for some people, it's really a path to upward mobility, right? And so to dismiss these programs as just there are no good reasons for doing a PhD, I think are just wrong, right? And then I'm also not really trying to dissuade anyone, but I just want people to know what they're getting into if they decide to go down this path. Right, so let's say you do decide, okay, you want to go to graduate school, you have good reasons for going to graduate school, right? The sad but true fact is that really, like many other things in life, graduate school applications are very arbitrary, right? So, you can do everything right and still not get in, right? There are no guarantees. So I think actually a more useful way to approach thinking about applying to graduate school is to think about the things that you can't control, the things that you have some degree of control over, and the things that you can control, right? So things that you can't control include things like, what programs are looking for, right? So programs have this sense of what kind of students they want to draw. They have a sense of what their own strengths and weaknesses are as a department, right? And you can't, change that about the department, right? You can't control who is on the admissions committee for the year you apply, right? And here at MIT, I'm not even sure, who is on the admissions committee next year, and who is on the admissions committee obviously affects who gets accepted ultimately to the program, right? And then you also cannot control who else is applying that year, right? And in PhD programs, you have this large applicant pool applying for a very limited number of spots, right? And so it is important to know who else, or maybe not to know, but it is important who else is applying in your year, but that's not something you have control over anyway, right? So the things that you do have some degree of control over are things like your GPA, which I guess at Yale NUS is called the CAT, right? Or your transcript. Obviously, you can't control what grades you get, right? But you can control what classes you apply for. You can control, how much effort or how much time and energy you spend on each class, right? Something else that you have some degree of control over is professors' recommendations. Again, you can't control what they write, but you can control, which professors you decide to approach to ask for a letter, right? You can decide how you want to cultivate a professional relationship with that professor, the person who's writing a recommendation letter, right? And then you can also have some degree of control over, in the programs that you apply to, which professors to reach out to, if any. And although you cannot control, of course, if they will reply or not, right? And I'm going to pause here and talk a little bit about this, because I think that this is a question I get a lot. So people ask me, should I reach out to professors in the programs that I'm applying to? And my personal experience is that I reached out to some professors, I didn't reach out to some professors. In the program I'm in at MIT, I didn't reach out to any professors, did not talk to anyone before I applied, right? And so I think, it can really vary. But I actually do suggest reaching out to professors, but really not for the sake of getting in, because lots of professors, get a lot of emails, they talk to a lot of students, right? And they might not remember you, right? But and often in these PhD programs, admissions are by committee anyway. So, one good interaction with the professor doesn't mean that your chances of getting in are maybe that much higher. Right, but I think that reaching out is actually for your own sake, right? So it's to answer two important questions. The first question is this professor interested in your research in the first place, right? Does what the professor want to do in their academic life align with what you want to do in your academic career? Right, and the second question, and this is crucial, is this professor even taking students for the next year in the first place, right? So if you apply to a program and you really want to work for the professor, but the professor isn't taking students, right, then that application in some ways is wasted, right? And then of course there are parts of the application that you can control, right? So things that like what you end up writing in your statement of purpose, right? I think the statement of purpose alongside your recommendations are the most important part of your application. Right, so you can decide how you want to frame your project, right? What kind of project is it? What kind of methods do you want to use? What kind of literatures do you want to intervene in? What kind of questions do you want to answer, right? And then one of the last things that you can control is where you end up applying to, right? And then so this is trying to get a sense of what kind of fit is what kind of fit is good for kind of the project they're interested in doing, right? And so my last section in this little bit is about thinking intra and interdisciplinarily, right? AKA what kind of program should I apply to, right? So there are many kinds of programs out there, right? So within the field of anthropology, you already have many different kinds, right? So you have what they call kind of traditional 4-field programs, right? So these programs think of anthropology as archaeology, physical or biological anthropology, social cultural anthropology, and linguistic anthropology. And so within these kinds of programs, you might have to take classes across all 4 subfields, whereas, for example, at MIT, in my anthropology program, I've never taken physical anthropology, I've never taken archaeology, right? So that matters, right? There are also programs of a specific topical focus, right? So UC Berkeley, UC San Francisco, for example, have a joint PhD in medical anthropology. And if you are interested in medical anthropology, this might be the program for you. If you are not interested in medical anthropology, this clearly is not the program for you, right? And then there are also programs, of course, with a more applied focus. So for example, at University of South Florida, you can get an MA or a PhD in applied anthropology. And what this program really tries to do is to prepare students to work outside the academy. Right. And then, of course, there are also programs that I call not just anthropology programs, right? And one of them, of course, is the program that I'm in at MIT in the History, Anthropology, Science, Technology, and Society program. I think that science and technology studies, STS, is very up and coming, and lots of people are interested. So if people want to ask specific questions about that, I'm also happy to answer that in the Q&A. And there are also programs that are more interdisciplinary. For example, University of Arizona has a joint PhD in anthropology and linguistics. And I see these two things as slightly different, right? So in a multidisciplinary program, you have the opportunity to take classes and to get training in multiple fields, but you don't have to, right? Versus an interdisciplinary program where you do have to write a dissertation that often fulfills the disciplinary standards of both disciplines or the multiple disciplines that the program is composed of. Right, and then there are also programs that are friendly to anthropology, but might not have anthropology necessarily in the name, right? So at University of Chicago, there is a program in comparative human development, which houses a lot of anthropologists, but is not necessarily an anthropology program per se. Right, and I think that these different kinds of programs, not just anthropology programs, there are pluses and minuses for sure. So in my program, for example, I've heard that people who graduate from my program can position themselves in different ways. Right, so to a history of science job, they might say I'm a historian of science. To a medical anthropology job, they might say I'm a medical anthropologist. And having such a long and capacious name means that we can have that kind of degree of maneuverability, right? On the other hand, there are certainly drawbacks, right? So I think that there's some sense in which we are seen, or we might even see ourselves as a jack of all trades, but a master of none. Right, so for me, when I was in the midst of my program, I do have to think carefully about how I want to structure my own path, right? So how I need to very consciously take classes with anthropologists, read lists in anthropology, and to be active in the broader kind of anthropological professional association. Right, and interdisciplinary, I think in the last couple of years has become this buzzword, but in many ways, the disciplines are still very siloed. Right, and so it can be hard to get recognition for work that doesn't fall neatly into any one discipline, right? And that's actually part of the reason why I didn't apply to CHD, even though there's a professor that I work still very closely with. At the same time, I would argue that in some sense, all anthropological work is interdisciplinary to some degree, right? So I think anthropology as a discipline itself is very capacious, very promiscuous in some ways, right? And so it's impossible for your work not to engage with the findings of some other field, right? And all that to say that you don't need to be in an interdisciplinary program to do interdisciplinary work. So I'm just going to conclude. I see I've already hit 15 minutes, so I'm just going to conclude with some resources that I think are useful. So these three pieces I found very helpful. One is by Melanie McAllister, Professor of American Studies at GW. Another is by Angela Jenks, who is Associate Professor of Teaching at UC Irvine. And then my friend at UC Berkeley, UCSF, wrote this piece in Quartz about applying to graduate school. So I'm going to put those three links in the chat. And what I find useful about these three pieces is that they combine both like the reality check with actual tips for applying to graduate school. And then, not to promote myself here, but I do have a section on my website. If you go down right to the bottom, contact, where I do have a list of resources that I found helpful when applying to graduate school. And I hope that you will find those pieces helpful as well. And then, of course, you can always reach out to me if you if you have any questions and want to talk more about graduate school. Okay, that's it. Thank you, everyone. And I look forward to question and answer.